I never thought of myself as a fearful person. That's the lie that kept everything in place. I wasn't anxious. I didn't panic. I didn't freeze when things went wrong. From the outside, I looked calm, measured, reasonable. People trusted me because I rarely took risks. They called it stability. I called it maturity. What I didn't call it for a very long time was fear. The truth is, fear doesn't always announce itself as terror. Sometimes it introduces itself as caution. As patience. As the voice that says, not now, wait, be smart. It doesn't tell you to stop living. It just suggests you take fewer chances until there's nothing left to chance at all. My life became a sequence of safe decisions. Each one made sense on its own. Each one had a justification. Together, they built something airtight. Predictable. Impossible to argue with. And suffocating. It started early, but quietly. I learned what disappointment looked like on other people's faces and memorized how to avoid it. I learned which choices led to approval and which ones required explanations. Over time, I stopped wanting anything that would put me on the defensive. I told myself I was flexible, adaptable, low maintenance. What I really was obedient to fear. Every time I stood at a crossroads, I chose the option that reduced immediate risk. Not long-term fulfillment, immediate risk. The path with fewer unknowns. Fewer eyes. Fewer chances to fail publicly. I didn't feel trapped. That's important. I felt protected. Fear is convincing when it promises safety. Years passed like this. My life filled up with sensible milestones. Nothing dramatic. Nothing embarrassing. Nothing that required me to stand alone and say, this is what I want. I became very good at saying, I'm fine either way. At some point, that stopped being diplomacy and became identity. The first time I noticed something was wrong, it wasn't because I was unhappy. It was because I felt strangely absent from my own decisions. I would agree to things and then feel disconnected from the outcome, as if someone else had signed on my behalf. I brushed it off. That's adulthood, I thought. You don't always feel passionate. You just do what needs to be done. But fear had already rewritten my definition of needs. I avoided opportunities that required visibility. I turned down possibilities that came with uncertainty. I stayed longer than I should have in places that felt familiar but hollow. Each time, fear handed me a reasonable excuse and I accepted it gratefully. I told myself that wanting more was childish. That ambition was unstable. That people who chased fulfillment were setting themselves up for disappointment. I didn't realize how much envy lived inside that judgment. At night, when everything went quiet, I sometimes imagined alternate versions of myself. Not wildly successful ones. Just braver ones. Versions who spoke when they felt something. Who left when they knew they should. Who chose discomfort over regret. Those versions felt distant, not impossible, but dangerous. So I returned to safety. Fear never asked me to do anything dramatic. It only asked me to delay. To wait until conditions were perfect. To gather more information. To be responsible. Waiting became my specialty. The problem with waiting is that it feels productive while it consumes your life. You tell yourself you're preparing, when in reality you're avoiding. And avoidance, when repeated long enough, becomes a worldview. I built a life where very little could go wrong and almost nothing could go right. People said I was lucky. That I had it together. That I avoided a lot of mistakes. I nodded and accepted the compliment, even as something inside me recoiled. Because avoiding mistakes isn't the same as making choices. The first crack came during a conversation that should have been ordinary. Someone asked me what I wanted next. Not hypothetically. Not kindly. Seriously. I opened my mouth and felt nothing. No desire rose to answer. No impulse. No internal signal to follow. My mind scanned for acceptable responses and found plenty. But none of them felt like mine. That moment passed. I said something vague. The conversation moved on. But I didn't. That night, I lay awake and understood something terrifying. Fear had done more than protect me. It had trained me not to want. And if you don't want, you don't choose. If you don't choose, you don't live, you maintain. I started to see my past clearly then. Not as a series of unlucky breaks or missed chances, but as a consistent pattern of retreat. I hadn't been unlucky. I had been obedient. Fear had become the quiet author of my life, and I had mistaken its handwriting for my own. That realization didn't come with courage. It came with dread. Because once you see fear for what it is, you face an impossible question: if you stop letting it decide, who will you be? I didn't know the answer. I only knew that continuing like this meant becoming someone who never failed because they never fully tried. And that, slowly, was breaking me. Once I recognized fear as the common thread, it rewrote my entire past. Moments I had labeled as being sensible rearranged themselves into something darker. I saw how often I had stepped back not because I lacked ability, but because I feared visibility. How many times I had chosen silence over honesty because honesty risked conflict. How frequently I had told myself this isn't the right time when what I really meant was I'm scared of what happens if I try. Fear had never blocked me. It had guided me gently away. That was the most humiliating part. There was no villain to blame. No traumatic origin story. Fear hadn't assaulted me, it had partnered with me. I had invited it into every decision, every pause, every compromise. I began to notice how deeply it had shaped my morality. I told myself I stayed in situations out of loyalty, when in truth I stayed because leaving would force me to confront uncertainty. I told myself I avoided risks because I didn't want to hurt others, when in truth I didn't want to be responsible for my own failure. Fear had dressed itself up as virtue. And I had applauded it. The realization triggered something like a slow internal collapse. Not a breakdown in the dramatic sense, a dismantling. Beliefs I had relied on began to feel hollow. Rules I had followed without question suddenly felt arbitrary. I wasn't living by values. I was living by avoidance. That awareness made everyday life unbearable. Conversations felt performative. Decisions felt dishonest. Even small choices, what to say, where to go, what to commit to, carried a weight they never had before. Every moment demanded a question I had spent years avoiding: am I choosing this, or am I hiding? That question exhausted me. Fear doesn't disappear when you expose it. It argues. It negotiates. It reminds you of everything you could lose. Stability. Approval. The illusion that your life makes sense. I listened to those arguments carefully and realized something else. Fear had never promised me happiness. Only control. Control over embarrassment. Over rejection. Over the possibility of regret. The irony was unbearable: in trying to avoid regret, I had built a life entirely made of it. Sleep became difficult. My mind replayed past moments with brutal clarity. Times I had stayed quiet when I should have spoken. Times I had said yes because no felt dangerous. Times I had watched doors close and told myself they were never meant for me anyway. Those justifications no longer worked. I felt anger for the first time in years, not outwardly, but inwardly. Anger at myself for cooperating. Anger at how easily I had surrendered authorship. Anger at the years I had spent calling fear wisdom. That anger scared me. Anger implies action. And action requires risk. Fear responded immediately. It reminded me that changing now would be irresponsible. That I had commitments. That people depended on me being predictable. That disrupting my life would hurt others. Some of that was true. That's what made it so effective. Fear doesn't lie outright. It selects truths that keep you frozen. The moral dilemma became unbearable. If I continued letting fear decide, I would preserve stability at the cost of myself. If I challenged it, I would destabilize everything I had built, not even knowing whether what I built next would be better. There was no guaranteed upside. Only the certainty of discomfort. I started to feel split in two. One part of me wanted to stay invisible and intact. The other wanted to be real, even if that meant being wrong, exposed, and alone. That split manifested physically. Tight chest. Shallow breath. Sudden waves of panic without obvious triggers. My body was reacting to years of suppression. Fear had kept me safe, but it had also kept me silent. The breaking point came in an unexpected way. Not through opportunity, but through loss. I watched someone close to me take a risk I would never have allowed myself. They failed. Publicly. Awkwardly. Painfully. And then they recovered. Not gracefully, not immediately, but honestly. Something inside me cracked open. I realized that my greatest fear had never been failure. It was survival after failure. I had believed that if I failed, I would be exposed as weak, incapable, unworthy. Watching someone fail and remain whole shattered that illusion. It showed me the truth fear had hidden, that pain is survivable but regret calcifies. That night, I admitted something to myself I had avoided for decades. I wasn't afraid of losing my life. I was afraid of living it without guarantees. And guarantees are incompatible with meaning. I began to see fear not as an enemy to defeat, but as a signal I had misunderstood. Fear wasn't telling me don't do this. It was telling me this matters. That reframing didn't make me brave. But it made me honest. The question was no longer whether fear would be present. It always would be. The question was whether I would continue letting it vote on every decision. For the first time, I considered the possibility that fear could come with me but not lead. That possibility terrified me more than staying ever had. Because it meant responsibility. Because it meant choice. Because it meant that whatever happened next would finally be mine. I stood at that edge for a long time, suspended between the life fear had curated for me and the unknown space beyond it. And I knew that whatever I did next would define whether fear remained my master or became just another voice in a life I was finally willing to claim. I didn't defeat fear. I stopped obeying it. That distinction matters more than anything. The first time I chose differently, it wasn't dramatic. I didn't leap. I didn't announce a new chapter. I made a small decision that fear had argued against for years, and I made it anyway, with my hands shaking and my voice unsure. Nothing collapsed. That was the shock. No one punished me. The ground didn't open. The version of myself I had been protecting didn't die. What happened instead was quieter and far more unsettling. I felt present. Fear screamed afterward. It catalogued every possible consequence, every imagined humiliation, every future regret. I listened, and then I didn't retreat. For the first time, fear spoke without deciding. That moment didn't feel brave. It felt exposed. Like standing without armor after years of wearing it to sleep. From there, everything changed slowly, unevenly. I didn't become fearless. I became discerning. I began asking a different question before decisions, not what's safest but what would I choose if I trusted myself to survive the outcome. That question rewired my days. Some choices led to discomfort. Some led to mistakes, a few led to loss. I didn't romanticize any of it. But something crucial shifted, the consequences felt honest. They belonged to me. The guilt faded first. Not because I stopped caring about others, but because I stopped using them as excuses. I learned the difference between responsibility and self-erasure. Fear had blurred that line intentionally. I lost some stability. I lost some approval. I lost the quiet praise that comes from never rocking the boat. What I gained was friction, and friction, I learned, is proof of movement. There were nights I wanted to go back to the old life where decisions were easy because fear had already made them. Where I could tell myself I was being wise instead of afraid. Where nothing truly bad happened and nothing truly good either. But I couldn't unsee what I had seen. Once you recognize fear as a ruler rather than a warning, submission feels violent. I began trusting my body again. When something tightened my chest, I paused not to retreat, but to listen. Was this fear protecting me from danger, or from growth? The answer wasn't always clear. That was the price. Clarity comes after action, not before it. I grieved the years fear had taken from me. Quietly. Honestly. Without trying to redeem them. Those years taught me something brutal and necessary: safety without authorship is another kind of prison. I stopped measuring my life by how little went wrong. I started measuring it by how often I showed up honestly, even when I was uncertain, even when I failed. Fear still speaks. Of course it does. It warns me when I'm exposed, when I'm vulnerable, when I might be rejected. I thank it and then I decide. That's the difference. If I have one confession left, it's this: fear didn't ruin my life. Letting it decide did. Fear will always exist. That's not the problem. The problem is confusing fear with wisdom, avoidance with maturity, silence with peace. I spent years calling my life calm when it was actually constrained. I called it stable when it was stagnant. I called it reasonable when it was ruled by fear I refused to name. I don't live like that anymore. My life now is messy, louder, less predictable, and infinitely more real. I make mistakes. I disappoint people. I stand by choices without guarantees. And at night, when everything goes quiet, I feel something I didn't know how to name before. Agency. If you're listening to this and recognizing yourself not in panic, not in chaos, but in quiet obedience, hear this: fear doesn't need to disappear for you to live. It only needs to stop deciding for you. You don't have to become fearless. You only have to stop calling fear your voice. I did that late. Imperfectly. With a lot of shaking. But I did it. And for the first time, my life finally sounds like me.